Hello, good evening and welcome to my model railway, Bedstead Junction. Now tonight we're going to be focusing on a particular designer British of our Great Western Railway, and it's the career of William Dean. Now he was Chief Mechanical Engineer of the Great Western Railway from the late 1870s through to 1902, and that's when George Jackson Churchward became Chief Mechanical Engineer. In fact, he became Chief Mechanical Engineer of the Great Western Railway in 1877. So he had quite a long career as Chief Mechanical Engineer. Now he took over from Joseph Armstrong, his predecessor, and Armstrong sadly passed away unexpectedly. So William Dean, who was his assistant, actually was actually thrown at the deep end to become Chief Mechanical Engineer. And this is one of his designs. It's the Dean single. You'll see these featured on other channels perhaps. Certainly I think Sam's Trains has featured them, and Barry Davis has featured them in his videos. But this is Lorna Doone. I've never seen Lorna Doone before. And how I got Lorna Doone, it's a bit of a long story, but cut it short. I was looking at Dean singles, and I did mean to get one, and I was looking at Achilles, and when you were looking at Achilles, the price of them second hand were on eBay at the time were just as much, if not more, than what they cost new. So I wasn't going to be paying out that much for a Dean single, I'm afraid. At the time that I didn't see any at the right price. Now I did let one train set go, unfortunately, which is the Flying Dutchman train set. If you ever see one of those and you're interested in Dean singles and it's the right price, if it was me personally, I mean, I obviously now I've got this one. I've got this is the one that I'm settled on. This particular one, I bought all these items separately, but the Flying Dutchman train set is definitely worth looking at. But we're looking at Lorna Doone tonight. Now, Lorna Doone is a Victorian book came out. It's a fiction, but it's set in Exmoor, and that's where it gives everything of an historical context. Because during the Victorian period, what a lot of people were looking for was romance and adventure. They were looking for romance and adventure. They're also looking for what they would call the picturesque, and certainly some people would have actually read the Lorna Doone book, and they would have been drawn to Exmoor, where the story of Lorna Doone was actually written about, and it actually refers to a lot of Exmoor locations, so people would have wanted to actually see those locations. It's a bit like nowadays where people might want to go and see, say for example, I think West Bay in Dorset, that's where Broadchurch was done. Maybe some people are drawn there. Some people are drawn to Coronation Street Studios, that sort of thing. Well, at the time, people would have been drawn to places which were actually in novels and legends. Obviously, King Arthur was another great attraction to the West Country. People would go in search of King Arthur. But with this particular one, people would have been in search of in Lorna Doone. Now, it's being a single, okay, it's only got one set of driving wheels. Okay, now that might sound pretty obvious, but a lot of people wouldn't know what a single is, and I don't blame you for not knowing if you're new to modern railways. And they were very much a Victorian design. At the time, it was seen that single wheelers were going to be the express locomotives, and single wheelers were going to be locomotives designed for speed. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to see if we can get this one to pull away. Just turn it nice and carefully. And we don't want to go too fast initially, because it being a single wheeler, you could get a lot of wheel spin. This particular one's got no traction tyres on it, and some of the later models do. And but this particular one, as you can see, it begins to gather at speed quite nicely, and it's pulling our Clerestory coaches, which are also a William Dean design. And William Dean was Chief Mechanical Engineer of the Great Western Railway, like I say, from 1877 to 1902. That's when George Jackson Churchward took over. Okay, so this is really one of the last of the great elegant Victorian singles. They were always drawn by 1915, and this particular model was drawn in 1912. And it might seem unusual that they would have been withdrawing locomotives in the middle of the First World War, but you have to bear in mind that a lot of the later designs had were starting to appear under Churchward, George Jackson Churchward, like the Saints, the Star classes, and his Moguls, and the 440 Counties. So these were coupled locomotives that Churchward was coming out with, and they were the replacement for the Dean singles. Now, this one is one of only 2,000 which are made by Hornby, and we'll take a little look at the certificates of authentication there. Okay, we've got Simon Kohler, I think Kohler, is it, of Hornby. He's still with Hornby now, isn't he? This one is number 1725 of the series of 2000. Now, I consider myself quite fortunate to find it because I've not seen one since for sale. And also I found this rake of 3 Clarestry coaches for sale, and they turned out to be in very, very good condition. I know a lot of people don't care much about boxes, but I do, and it does mean a lot to me to get something boxed. I think a locomotive to me and rolling stock is worth much more if it comes with the boxes. And we're just watching this one go round. Look at that! Isn't that beautiful? And it's doing a very, very fine job now of pulling the train. I'm going to take a closer look at her in just a moment. I featured Lorna Doone before, but tonight I thought I needed a subject matter, so we'll be talking about William Dean. And we'll be looking at another one of his locomotives. Now, these locomotives span, really, in railway service terms, right the way from the late 1800s, going right through to the 1950s. I mean, these didn't see that far in service, but the next locomotive which you'll be seeing actually did. And a very, very interesting history behind the next locomotive which you'll be seeing. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to be putting our lovely Lorna Doone into the station in just a moment. Now, you can imagine that this locomotive is full of happy passengers, and they've called a train at Paddington. Some of them will have read Lorna Doone, and now they're going to be looking for places where some of the Lorna Doone scenes were actually set in the book. Okay, so perhaps we can imagine this locomotive pulling in now from Paddington into one of the stations, and maybe they would have carried on then by coach, maybe onto their destinations, or maybe by train, because there was railways going into Exmoor. There was obviously there's the West Somerset Railway, which took you to Minehead, and that would be quite close to Exmoor then, quite close to Porlock and to Exmoor. So if we just slow her down in just a moment, and we're going to take her over to the signal box. Just gliding elegantly to the signal there. Now, we've got one thing you need to bear in mind, that because this is a single design, single wheeler, and it's got no traction tyres, sometimes, I will be honest about it, grip or traction could be a problem if there's any sign of oil on the tracks, or any sign of any contamination on the driving wheels. They need to be absolutely clean on one of these. But we're going to put her into the station, and we'll just and then we'll get our next locomotive out. Now, I'm going to try not to kick the tripod. We're trying to manoeuvre a size 10 pair of feet around the tripod. It needs to be done with a certain amount of care. I don't always miss the tripod. Right, and then you can see how our Lorna Doone handles points. Now, what they've done is on these they've got pickups also on the front bogie. So it does give it some additional pickup of current for us to be able to drive this locomotive over points. So we're going to see if it actually does it. We'll give it a nice, put it away nice and slowly. There we go. I need to pick up the speed really slow on this. Over the points, look beautiful, look at that. And there is Lorna Doone. Sorry, the tripod's a bit stiff tonight. Oh, there we go, a bit better now. Okay, so we're looking at Lorna Doone now, and maybe we can zoom in on her. Obviously it says Great Western on the tender, because they never got to see British Rail service. And there it is. It's a single. And you can see there, if you don't mind me, the giant finger. There's the driving wheel there, the single driving wheels. Now, I think these were 7 feet, maybe 8. Yeah, I think they were 7 feet driving wheels. They were not the largest driving wheels seen on the Great Western Railway. In fact, there was certainly a model I'd like to see at some point being made. I don't know who would actually go on this because it was a broad gauge locomotive, but there was an engineer called James Pearson, and his engines were referred to as Pearson's monsters by some people. They had 9 feet driving wheels, and they were designed for the Bristol and Exeter Railway, as it was at the time. The Bristol and Exeter Railway was an independent of the Great Western Railway, and he was their chief mechanical engineer. And yes, 9 feet driving wheels. And at the time, though, they were quite swift, the Pearson's monsters. I know that's a bit of I digress slightly from these, but this is an idea of the kind of single-wheeled locomotives that you could actually see appearing on the Great Western Railway, or railways that were about to become part of the Great Western. Now, we won't be able to see the cab on this, but you can see it's got the copper chimney and the brass valve covers. It's got the steam dome on it, and what an elegant looking locomotive. And we can have a look at these lovely clerestory coaches as well here as well. Look at those. The reason why they're called clerestory coaches is because they've got the additional windows in the top, and that's because these coaches were actually gas lit. Okay, and that's 2 composite coaches there, and then the brake at the back. Absolutely superb. So that's my rake of coaches, and with my Lorna Doone taking the train. And I know I've already featured this in another video, but I make no apologies for showing it again. I wanted to get this one out again tonight. And now what we're going to do is we're going to set the points in, and we're going to get our next train out, which is going to be a nice little engine. I don't get this one out very often, but I love it when I do. And we just need to move around the tripod. And we're just trying to manoeuvre my feet round. So we cut the line off from there. Right. I have made some schoolboy errors in the past with points, so please forgive me if I do this tonight. And we'll have a look at our Dean Goods. Here it comes. The Dean Goods. And this is in BR Black. Because yes, these did go on to CBR service. We just set the main line, and it's putting a nice little selection of wagons here, made by different makers. Now we're talking a little bit about the locomotive as well, and something about their history. We're just going to get ourselves into forward gear, check the points, and we pull away. Now you see this one pulls away and takes the train very, very well. And this would have been what the locomotive would have looked like in British Rail service. Now I think they were always drawn by the mid-1950s, I think probably one of the reasons for that was that they'd obviously done a very, very great sterling service for the Great Western Railway and then the Western Region of British Rail, and there were a lot of Collet goods locomotives available, designed by Collet, but these are very much a very, very useful design. Now, they were used in both World Wars. They went across to Europe in both World War One and World War Two, and were used by the War Department. And many of these were actually requisitioned for war service. And then, unfortunately, some of these locomotives never actually made it back. Now, I believe that even at least one of the locomotives that was in World War One actually went on to serve with the Turkish railways. So that gives you some idea of their usefulness. I mean, they were being withdrawn before World War Two, but I think they were all sort of taken out of mothballs during World War Two for use again by the War Department. So that's how useful these engines actually really were. Now, this model is made by a manufacturer called Oxford Rail. Some of you might not have any Oxford Rail locomotives. This is one which I bought during the lockdown, and I was interested to see what the Oxford Rail Dean goods was actually like. And as you see, it runs really well. It ran very well out of the box. And it's an 060. And this is an interesting thing. I mean, that Dean would have actually produced his express locomotive, which is our Lorna Doone, his Dean, as a single wheeler. So that must be to get the speed. Whereas it was decided that an 060 would be used for freight, probably to get the extra traction to be able to pull the weight of the train. So it's two interesting design differences. Now, this is BR Black in the early crest. I don't think they would have gone on to go into the late crest, because the late crest didn't come out to 1956, 1957, and these were all withdrawn in the mid-1950s. I think one Dean single does remain in preservation, but I don't think any are running. There is one at the Swindon Museum, and if you ever get a chance to visit the Swindon Museum, yes, it's well worth visiting. Now, another thing which happened during Dean's career was the conversion of the Great Western Railway from broad gauge to standard gauge. And if you look into the history of the railways, if you imagine now Brunel favoured I think it was a 7.25" gauge as opposed to the standard gauge of the locomotives. He regarded the broad gauge as being far superior for running purposes, and yes, it did actually enable, during the time of Brunel onwards, for the Great Western Railway to employ larger engines on the broad gauge and wider carriages perhaps, but the trouble actually started where the gauges actually met. So you can imagine that the Great Western Railway was built in broad gauge, and the rest of the railway system was being built in standard gauge. Now, even if the broad gauge was superior, as Brunel regarded it to be, I don't think the rest of the country would have gone over from standard gauge to broad gauge. That would have meant they would have had to widen everything on their system. So it actually came to the fact that the broad gauge ceased to be, and it was gone by the end of the Victorian era. A lot of the conversion was taking place. In fact, a lot of the railway system on the Great Western Railway, where it joined other railways, I think they had to put in a third rail to allow the broad gauge locomotives and rolling stock to run. But obviously the clash of the gauges couldn't go on forever, so William Dean was responsible for the broad gauge, for the transition of the Great Western Railway from the broad gauge to the standard gauge. Yes, I mean, I'm cheating by reading the leaflet that came with it, but it was in 1917 that 62 of the locomotives, that's in World War I, were retained by the Railway Operating Division to work in France. And 14 were sent to Salonika, of which 8 managed to survive to be returned to the UK, while 2 of the class were sold to Ottoman Railways, one of which remained in service for the 1950s. So yeah, so this was actually used of the Ottoman Railways, would it be Turkey? So one of these was used in Turkey until the 1950s. So what a sign of the usefulness of these locomotives. And in fact, I think they were used as well on a lot of railways, especially in North Wales. The Cambrian Coast Railway, Dean goods were used quite a lot because there was severe weight limits on a lot of the railway lines there, and on other parts of the Great Western System. Eventually, of course, they were replaced by other locomotives, but they were useful for that purpose too. And in fact, it just says here in the Second World War, 100 Dean goods were requisitioned by the from the GID by the War Department, and 79 were shipped to France in the Second World War. Obviously, they must have been lost. In fact, I think they were used by the occupying forces, unfortunately. They were absorbed. They were taken as spoils of war by the Germans and absorbed into the German occupying forces transportation system. And after the Second World War, only 30 of the locomotives were actually repatriated. But of course, they did go on to serve into BR service. In fact, 54 of these Dean goods locomotives lasted until 1948. And then they were absorbed into National Railways. Oh, by December 1957 it was, all these remaining locomotives were being totally withdrawn from service. So it was a little bit later than I thought, so in 1957 these were withdrawn. In fact, I got confused with the Saints class, which I think were withdrawn in 1953, but these carried on into 1957. Now, I bought this one actually, was quite fortunate. They turned up at quite a bargain price on Amazon for a short period of time, so I think everyone would have missed a boat. But they were advertised for about £69. I think the recommended retail price was over 100. I mean, whether the black locomotive wasn't as popular as the Great Western versions, I don't know, because obviously the Great Western ones had great sort of decoration on them. They had sort of more kind of the brass work on them and everything else. But I quite like this one in the BR Black. Some people say that the BR Black was a sign of dreary austerity after World War II, but in my opinion I think the black looks rather smart. Now, one thing you need to bear in mind about this, about any of my locomotives that are running on my railway, is that sometimes if there are one or two sort of like slowdowns and mishaps, that's only because this railway is taken apart at the end of every running session. In fact, it will be in just a few moments' time. And I will be actually putting all of my locomotive system away tonight. And then it needs to be all put back together again at the beginning of every running session. So obviously with the kind of thing like this, it needs me to keep an eye on the fish plates and everything else. This will probably take me about 20 minutes to take all this down tonight. But I hope this has been of interest to you. I thought I'd focus on the work of William Dean, because I don't think there's much focus on his actual railway career. And certainly there's a lot of focus on Brunel, obviously, because he's a great hero of anybody that's a Great Western fan, because obviously he was responsible for the building of the Great Western Railway from London Paddington to Bristol. And obviously they put Bristol on the map as far as railways concerned. There's another interesting thing too about the Victorian era, is that before the railways, Britain had different time zones. I think there was a 10-minute difference in time between London and Bristol. And in fact, if you happen to be in Corn Street, you look in the Corn Market, I think there's a clock with 2 hands on it to show that to allow for the time difference. The Corn Exchange was where a lot of the trading was done in Victorian times, and the coming of the railways actually resulted in there being a standard time being brought in, because obviously you couldn't be arriving in different parts of the UK at different times of day. It would have been difficult to set your watch to allow for the time differences. And of course business needed to be done over the United Kingdom as well. So that's another interesting fact about what the railways brought. But I think the actual chief mechanical engineers was Daniel Gooch, who worked with Brunel, Armstrong, who sadly passed away in service, Dean, George Jackson Churchward, Charles Benjamin Collett, and finally Hawkesworth. So you've got that's still the sort of dynasty of the Great Western Railway designers. Okay, so I hope that this has been of interest to you tonight. It was a quick one, sort of made on the spur of the moment. And if you like what you see, then press like and subscribe. Now this is being recorded on a Saturday night and it's 10:30, so I'm going to take this down in just a few moments. But this will probably not go out until Sunday. I need to take some time to put all this together onto the computer. Maybe add a title as well. Okay, so well, thank you very much for watching. Like I say, if you like it, press like and subscribe and ring that bell. Thanks for your interest. I hope this has been of interest to you. And thank you very much for watching, and good night.